blood smells like rusted pennies and wet copper. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the frantic knocking at my apartment door at 2 in the morning, not the freezing rain. Just the sharp, metallic tang clinging to the massive man holding a shivering child in his arms. Rain lashed against the single-pane glass of my living room window, vibrating the cheap frame. It was a miserable Tuesday in November. I lived above an all-night laundromat, and my apartment perpetually smelled of industrial bleach, stale dryer lint, and old cooking grease. It was a scent that usually grounded me, a reminder of the quiet, invisible life I had carved out for myself in this forgotten corner of the city. Then the knocking started. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud that threatened to splinter the cheap pine of my front door. I didn't want to answer it. I sat on my sagging corduroy sofa, a half-empty mug of cold coffee in my hands, and stared at the deadbolt. Normal people don't knock on doors in this neighborhood at 2 in the morning unless they want money, drugs, or blood. I wasn't a hero. I was a cynical, exhausted man running on 4 hours of sleep and a handful of black market scent suppressants. I held my breath, waiting for them to give up and walk away. The knocking stopped. Then, a sound cut through the steady hiss of the rain. A child's cough, wet, ragged, and agonizingly small. I cursed under my breath. The mug clattered against the veneer of the coffee table. I walked to the door, my bare feet sticking slightly to the peeling linoleum, and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway light was a flickering, fluorescent nightmare, casting sickly yellow shadows. He stood directly under it. The man was huge, his broad shoulders filling the narrow frame of the peephole. A heavy wool overcoat clung to him, soaked completely through, dripping rainwater onto the dirty hallway runner. But it was what he carried that made my hand move toward the deadbolt. A boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, wrapped inside the man's coat, pressing his flushed face into the stranger's neck. The kid let out another rattling cough. I threw the deadbolt and opened the door a fraction, leaving the security chain engaged. "What do you want?" My voice was rough, defensive. The man shifted his weight. He didn't push against the door. He didn't beg. He just looked at me. His eyes were the color of shattered flint, cold and disturbingly calm for a man standing in a freezing hallway with a sick kid. Water ran down the sharp line of his jaw. "My car died," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the kind of sound you feel in your chest before you hear it. "My son is burning up. We just need to be inside." I caught his scent then. It rolled through the 3-inch gap in the door, thick and suffocating. Bitter espresso, crushed cedar, and the ozone smell of a coming storm. Alpha, a powerful one. My stomach tightened, a hard knot of resentment and involuntary biology. I hated alphas. They took up too much space. They demanded too much oxygen. I was an unregistered omega, hiding in plain sight, and letting a strange alpha into my home was practically begging for a death wish. "There's a hospital 4 blocks down," I told him, keeping my tone flat. "Go there." "I can't take him to a hospital," the man said evenly. There was no explanation, just a statement of absolute fact. He adjusted his grip on the boy. Underneath the heavy coat, I caught a glimpse of a tailored suit jacket. Ruined by the rain, but undeniably expensive. Silk blend, custom stitching. It didn't belong in this neighborhood. Neither did the dark red stains spreading across the man's white dress shirt just below his ribs. Blood, rusted pennies, and wet copper. "Please," a tiny voice rasped. The boy turned his head slightly, peering at me through fever-bright, glassy eyes. His lips were chapped, his face unnaturally pale except for the bright, red circles of fever on his cheeks. My grip on the door tightened until my knuckles ached. I wanted to shut it. I really did. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to slam the door, lock it, and slide a chair under the knob. The man was dangerous. You didn't need a wolf's instincts to know that. The stillness in his posture, the way his eyes tracked the shadows in my apartment, the blood on his shirt, it all pointed to a specific kind of violence. But the kid coughed again, his small chest heaving with the effort. My biology betrayed me. A low, humiliating ache bloomed in my sternum. A deep-seated urge to nest, to protect, to soothe. I hated it. I hated that I couldn't completely silence the instinct, no matter how many pills I choked down. 10 minutes, I snapped, unhooking the chain. You get him dry, you figure out your next move, and then you get out. I stepped back. The alpha walked in. The sheer physical presence of him seemed to shrink the room. He didn't say thank you. He just stepped over the threshold, his boots leaving muddy footprints on the linoleum. I locked the door behind him, the metallic click sounding entirely too loud in the sudden silence of the apartment. Put him on the sofa, I said, pointing to the corduroy monstrosity. Don't bleed on the cushions. He shot me a look. It wasn't angry, just calculating. He walked to the sofa and gently laid the boy down, peeling back the heavy, soaking wet overcoat. The contrast between the man's brutal size and the shocking gentleness of his hands was jarring. It made my skin prickle. I turned my back to them, heading toward the tiny kitchenette to put the kettle on. I needed something to do with my hands before they started shaking. I filled the aluminum kettle with tap water, the rushing sound momentarily drowning out the heavy, oppressive silence that had settled over the apartment. When I turned back around, the alpha was conducting a silent sweep of my living room. He hadn't moved from his spot near the sofa, but his eyes were cataloging everything. The fire escape window, the flimsy lock on the front door, the hallway leading to my bedroom and bathroom. He was establishing sight lines, assessing threats. He wasn't acting like a panicked father with a sick kid. He was acting like a soldier securing a perimeter. I have some ibuprofen, I said, my voice too loud. I pulled open a drawer and dug past a pile of takeout menus to find the plastic bottle. And a thermometer. Bring them, he ordered. He didn't yell, but the command was absolute. I bristled. This isn't your house, I muttered. But I walked over anyway, tossing the bottle onto the coffee table. I grabbed a faded yellow towel from the bathroom and tossed it to him. He caught it one-handed. He began drying the boy's hair with careful, methodical strokes. The kid Leo, I heard the man murmur, was shivering violently, his teeth chattering. Take his wet clothes off, I told the alpha. I have a heavy quilt in the closet. Give me a second. When I came back dragging a thick patchwork quilt I'd bought at a thrift store, the boy was stripped down to his underwear. I draped the heavy blanket over him, tucking the edges under his small frame to trap the heat. My fingers accidentally brushed the boy's shoulder. His skin was radiating heat like a furnace. He's burning up, I muttered, twisting the cap off the ibuprofen. How long has he had the fever? Since this afternoon, the man said. He was watching my hands closely as I measured out the liquid medicine. I held the small plastic cup to Leo's lips. Hey kid, you gotta drink this. It tastes like fake cherries. Leo whimpered, turning his face away. Leo, the alpha said, one word laced with a strange mixture of warmth and absolute authority. The boy opened his eyes, looked at the man, and obediently opened his mouth. I tipped the medicine in. I stepped back, suddenly hyper-aware of how close I was standing to the alpha. He had taken off his ruined suit jacket. The white shirt was plastered to his torso, translucent from the rain. The bloodstain on his side was dark and clotted. Beneath his left arm, strapped securely to his ribs by a leather shoulder holster, was a matte black, semi-automatic pistol. I stared at the gun. I didn't gasp or flinch. I just stared at it, a cold, heavy resignation settling in my gut. Of course. The man noticed where I was looking. He didn't try to cover the weapon. He just reached down and calmly adjusted the holster. It's been a long night, was all he said. I don't want any trouble, I told him, crossing my arms over my chest, trying to put a barrier between us. His scent was filling the room, thick cedar and static electricity, pushing against my artificial lack of scent. It was making my head spin. Whoever you're running from, I don't want them bringing their mess to my door. No one followed us, he said softly. He sat heavily on the edge of the coffee table, his knees inches from my legs. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his broad shoulders slumped for a fraction of a second before he caught himself. I made sure of it. I didn't want to know what made sure of it meant. I walked back to the kitchen as the kettle began to whistle. I poured boiling water into a cracked mug, dropping in a bag of cheap chamomile tea. "What's your name?" the man asked. His voice drifted from the living room, filling the cramped space. "Caleb," I answered. I didn't ask for his. I didn't want to know it. Names made things real. "Gideon," he offered anyway. I carried the tea back and set it on the coffee table. "You're bleeding, Gideon." He glanced down at his side as if he'd forgotten the wound was there. "It's a graze, just messy." "I have gauze and antiseptic under the bathroom sink," I offered grudgingly. "You bleed on my floor. You're cleaning it up." A ghost of a smirk played on his lips. It transformed his harsh face for a second, revealing something darkly handsome beneath the grime and exhaustion. "I'll be careful, Caleb." He stood up, towering over me. As he moved past to head toward the bathroom, it was a fleeting contact, just damp cotton scraping against my long-sleeved shirt, but the friction sent a jolt of pure heat straight down my spine. My breath hitched. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, frantic rhythm. Gideon paused. He stopped dead in the hallway. He didn't turn around, but I saw the muscles in his broad back tense. He slowly tilted his head, inhaling deeply. My blood ran cold. The suppressants, they were cheap, bought from a guy operating out of the back of a bodega. They were supposed to last 12 hours, but fear and stress metabolized them faster. My natural scent, something muted and sweet, like dried apples and old wood, was leaking through the chemical barrier. He knew. He stood there for a long, terrible moment, the silence stretching taut between us. Then, without a word, he stepped into the bathroom and shut the door. I sank onto the arm of a nearby chair, my legs shaking. The kid on the sofa was finally sleeping, the heavy quilt rising and falling with his breath. I looked at the rain lashing against the dark window pane, realizing exactly how thoroughly I had just screwed up my quiet, invisible life. The bathroom door clicked open. I flinched, my fingers tightening on the ceramic rim of my empty mug. Gideon stepped out into the narrow hallway. He had discarded the ruined dress shirt. His torso was a map of old violence, faded white lines cutting across thick, dense muscle, a puckered, star-shaped scar near his collarbone that looked suspiciously like a bullet wound. The fresh injury was a jagged, ugly tear along his left oblique. It wasn't a clean graze. Something had snagged and ripped the skin, and it was sluggishly weeping dark blood. He held a wad of cheap, single-ply toilet paper against it, his face tight. "I need a hand," he said. The gravel in his voice was thicker now, heavy with fatigue. I didn't want to. I wanted him to stay on his side of the room, preferably in a different zip code. But I looked at the blood seeping through his fingers, then at the sleeping kid on my sofa. If he bled out on my cheap linoleum, I'd have a dead alpha and an orphan child to explain to the police. That sounded like a lot of paperwork. "Sit on the toilet lid," I muttered, pushing myself up from the chair. I grabbed the first aid kit from under the kitchen sink, a rusty metal tin I'd stolen from an old auto shop job years ago. When I walked into the cramped bathroom, Gideon was sitting exactly where I'd told him. He dwarfed the space. His knees practically touched the bathtub. The smell of copper was overpowering in the small room, masking the faint scent of my cheap coconut shampoo. I knelt on the cold tiles. "Move your hand." He dropped the bloody toilet paper into the trash can. I poured harsh, generic rubbing alcohol onto a cotton pad. "This is going to burn." "Just do it, Caleb." I pressed the soaked cotton against the raw edges of the tear. His abdominal muscles instantly locked into solid stone under my fingers. A sharp, involuntary hiss escaped his teeth, but he didn't pull away. He didn't even twitch. I worked in silence, cleaning the sluggish blood, my hands uncomfortably close to his bare skin. The physical reality of him was overwhelming. He radiated a dry, heavy heat. His scent, cedar, ozone, and that dark, bitter espresso was no longer a subtle undertone. It was rolling off him in waves, thick with pain and the residual adrenaline of whatever gunfight he had just walked away from. And beneath it, pushing through my failing suppressants, was my own scent, dried apples and old wood, sweeter than it should be. Panicked. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the wound, refusing to look at his face. I unrolled a length of white gauze. "Lift your arm." He raised his left arm. I had to lean in to wrap the bandage around his waist. My cheek brushed against his bare chest. The friction sent a violent shudder through my nervous system. My biology was screaming at me alpha, injured, pack, soothe, a pathetic, primal litany that I despised. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted my own blood, using the sharp pain to anchor my rational mind. I pulled the gauze tight, maybe a little tighter than strictly necessary, and taped it off. "Done," I said, rocking back on my heels. Gideon didn't stand up. He looked down at me, his slate-gray eyes heavily lidded but entirely focused. The silence in the bathroom stretched, thick and suffocating. The dripping of the leaky bathtub faucet sounded like gunshots. "You're an Omega," he stated. It wasn't a question. There was no judgment in his tone, no predatory gleam, just a flat, factual observation. "I'm a guy who wants you out of his apartment as soon as the sun comes up." I fired back, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't carry to the living room. I stood up, grabbing the bloody cotton pads and tossing them away. "What I am doesn't matter. You don't know me. I don't know you. Your suppressants are failing," he pointed out, ignoring my deflection. "They smell like black market garbage, strychnine, laced with synthetic hormones. They'll rot your liver before you turn 30. "They keep me off the registry," I snapped, turning to face him. My hands were shaking, so I shoved them deep into the pockets of my sweatpants. "They keep alphas like you from looking at me twice, usually." Gideon finally stood. He had to duck his head slightly to avoid the low ceiling fixture. He stepped out of the bathroom, giving me a wide berth, a deliberate show of restraint. "I'm not going to touch you, Caleb. You opened your door for my son. In my world, that means you have my protection. You have nothing to fear from me." "I don't want your protection." I followed him out, my voice tight. "Your world involves bullet holes and midnight runs in the freezing rain. I want to be left alone." He stopped by the sofa, looking down at Leo. The kid's breathing had evened out. The flush on his cheeks was less angry. The cheap ibuprofen was working. Gideon reached out, his large, calloused hand gently brushing the damp hair from the boy's forehead. The absolute tenderness of the gesture hit me like a physical blow. It was the contradiction that broke me, the lethal, bleeding man with a gun strapped to his ribs, looking at a sick child like he was the only fragile thing left on earth. "Sometimes," Gideon said softly, his back still to me, "we don't get what we want, Caleb. Sometimes the world knocks on our door anyway." He sat heavily on the floor, leaning his uninjured side against the base of the sofa, keeping himself between the front door and his son. He closed his eyes. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, watching him breathe. I didn't go back to my bedroom. I sat at the small, wobbly dining table, staring at the deadbolt. I listened to the rain slowly taper off into a miserable drizzle, waiting for the dawn, and wondering exactly how much of a mess I had just let inside. Dawn didn't break. It bled through the dirty window pane like a gray bruise. The apartment was freezing. The radiator hissed in the corner, offering a pathetic illusion of warmth. But the draft from the single-pane glass won the battle. I sat at the kitchen table, my spine aching from the hard wooden chair. I hadn't slept a wink. Gideon was exactly where he had been 4 hours ago, sitting on the floor against the sofa. But he wasn't asleep. His eyes were open, tracking the dust motes drifting in the weak morning light. In the cold light of day, he looked even more dangerous. The exhaustion hadn't softened his features. It had sharpened them, pulling the skin tight over his cheekbones. On the sofa, Leo stirred. The boy let out a soft groan, shifting under the heavy thrift store quilt. Gideon was on his feet instantly, moving with a silent, fluid grace that betrayed his massive size. He knelt beside the sofa. "Leo," he murmured. The boy blinked open his eyes. They were a pale, startling blue, a stark contrast to his father's dark slate. He looked around, confused by the peeling wallpaper and the smell of industrial bleach from the laundromat downstairs. Then his eyes found Gideon, and his small shoulders relaxed. Papa. His voice was reedy, weak, but the terrifying wet rattle was gone. But, I'm here, Gideon said, pressing the back of his hand to the boy's forehead. Fever broke. You're just warm now. I stood up, my knees popping loudly in the quiet room. I have some canned soup, chicken noodle. It's mostly sodium, but it's easy to keep down. Gideon looked up at me. That would be good. Thank you. I opened the dented can, dumped it into a saucepan, and turned on the gas burner. The smell of artificial chicken broth soon filled the air, warring with the lingering scents of dried apples and sharp cedar. I poured the soup into a bowl and brought it to the coffee table, along with a glass of tap water. Leo sat up slowly, clutching the quilt around his chest. He looked at me with open curiosity. Are you a doctor? I let out a short, hollow laugh. No, kid. I'm just a guy with a couch. He took the spoon with a shaky hand and blew on the broth. Gideon watched him eat, the tension in his broad shoulders unwinding fraction by fraction. While the kid ate, Gideon pulled a heavy black burner phone from the pocket of his damp trousers. He typed out a brief message, hit send, and immediately snapped the phone in half, tossing the plastic pieces onto the coffee table beside my empty mug. My ride will be here in 10 minutes, Gideon announced, his voice devoid of emotion. My chest tightened. Relief, I told myself. It was just relief that they were finally leaving. I wouldn't have to look at the gun anymore, or smell the blood, or fight the heavy, suffocating gravity of the Alpha's presence. Good, I said smoothly. Take your ruined coat. Throw it away in the dumpster out back. I don't want anyone finding it in my trash. Gideon picked up the damp wool overcoat and threw it over his arm. He didn't put the bloody dress shirt back on. He just wore the black leather shoulder holster over his bare, heavily scarred chest. He looked like a nightmare walking out of a pulp comic. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a thick money clip. It was solid silver, engraved with a crest I didn't recognize, a wolf head biting down on a dagger. He peeled off a stack of $100 bills, 10 of them, $1,000. He placed the stack on the cheap veneer of my coffee table. I don't want your money, I said, my voice hardening. I felt a sudden, irrational flash of anger. This wasn't a transaction. You forced your way in. I gave you some cheap medicine. We're done. Gideon stepped closer. He invaded my personal space, towering over me. I forced myself to hold my ground, tilting my head back to meet his eyes. His scent spiked a heavy, dominant wave of crushed cedar that made my pulse jump in my throat. Take the money, Caleb, he commanded softly. Buy better suppressants. Move to an apartment with a deadbolt that actually works. Put it under a mattress. I don't care, but take it. Why? I challenged, my hands curling into fists. So you can feel better about bringing your Mafia garbage to my door? A dark, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. No, because I owe you a debt, and men like me do not leave debts unpaid. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper that vibrated right through my sternum. I know your scent now, Caleb. Dried apples and old wood. I won't forget it. He didn't wait for a response. He turned, scooped Leo up into his arms, wrapping the boy in the damp overcoat, and walked to the front door. He unlatched the deadbolt, stepped out into the flickering yellow light of the hallway, and shut the door firmly behind him. The silence he left behind was absolute. I stood in the center of my living room for a long time. I looked at the blood on the bathroom trash can, the empty soup bowl, the broken pieces of the burner phone, and the stack of crisp $100 bills on the table. The apartment smelled like bleach, stale grease, and crushed cedar. I walked over to the door and locked the deadbolt. My hands were perfectly steady. I had survived the night. I was safe. I was invisible again. I walked. But as I leaned my forehead against the cold wood of the door, inhaling the lingering, phantom scent of the alpha, I knew it was a lie. The quiet life I had fought so hard to build was over. Gideon had left my apartment, but he had taken the safety of my isolation with him. Caleb survived the night, but the quiet life he protected is gone forever. Will Gideon keep his distance? Or is this cynical Omega about to be dragged into a brutal Mafia war? If this gritty Omegaverse romance kept you hooked, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Drop a comment below. Would you take the alpha's money? Turn on notifications. The real danger is just beginning.